So, hi everyone. Welcome back to the VQA workshop. And our next speaker is Karl Moritz Hermann. Karl is a research scientist at DeepMind in Berlin. And Karl has done some extensive work in natural language understanding, including distributed representations, machine reading and comprehension, inference, and question answering. Related to this workshop, recently Karl has been working on vision and language navigation in Street View dataset. And without further delay, let's welcome Karl.
Thank you. Yeah, my talk today is going to be about language learning, and so specifically about grounded language learning in machines. So I guess instead of approaching VQA from the vision perspective, this is much more about sort of doing it the other way around, as in thinking about how can we better understand language by adding other modalities into the equation. The concrete bits of work I'm going to cover is joint work with a bunch of people, colleagues at DeepMind, so obviously blame those guys for everything that you might find questionable. But before I go into the sort of concrete bits of work, I just thought, this being a vision conference, maybe I want to sort of talk a little bit more about why I think language is a really interesting research topic, and you're at the wrong place. So, how does this work? I suppose coming to the visual QA workshop is a good starting point, so thank you for being here. But yeah, I think that language is at the end of the day the most interesting manifestation of our intelligence, and more than that, language is one of sort of our most characteristic and amazing cognitive systems. And by saying language is a cognitive system, what I want to emphasize is that language is a component of human intelligence. It's not something in the world external to the human or an agent. It's not something that we can sort of study without having the human there or having the agent there. And also very importantly, language can be used to express all other forms of intelligence. We can pretty much talk about everything we feel, we see, we observe, and this is really hard to do the other way around. There's some schools in Germany where you learn how to dance your name, but this is like a really, really inefficient means of communication. And also, all children acquire language, and they acquire language effortlessly. They can generalize. This whole thing happens really early, really instinctively, and they can acquire language sort of even in the face of obstacles such as blindness or deafness or other things that restrict their interaction with the wider world. This process is like both sort of completely mysterious, and we have no idea how it works, and astonishing, and especially when you compare this with machine learning, where you need these massive amounts of samples, and we still don't do a great job of generalizing. Children, on the other hand, they generalize readily to new words, new sentences. They can generalize to new situations. They don't need a new language when faced with a new context. And finally, also, language is extensible and combinatorial. So, someone from 200 years ago would pretty much understand what I'm talking about here, except for maybe not being able to ground this concept of artificial intelligence. And the combinatorial thing also means that, we can put together arbitrarily long sentences and they make sense to you. And this kind of leads to the next bit, because language is obviously very, very cool, but also really, really annoying, because you get these sort of unbounded inputs that you don't know quite how to deal with. Let's talk very briefly about why language is hard and hence sort of a worthwhile research subject. As I said, it's a cognitive system, so it's integral to the human. We can't study it without. The fact that only humans have language makes this hard to study in the same way that's of general intelligence is hard to study. We don't observe this outside of the human. Also, language comes with a ton of unconscious knowledge. So when we talk about native speaker knowing a language, what we mean is of the native speaker's instinctive knowledge of the language. A lot of this stuff is very subconscious, but it's also very robust, which makes it very, very difficult to write down as a set of rules. And then what I already mentioned earlier, sort of this whole question about acquisition and generalization. In humans, this stuff is incredibly efficient. In machine learning, it's incredibly not efficient. And this is something that sort of makes this a really interesting topic also from the perspective of thinking about how humans learn language. And finally, generalization is important. This whole thing of how do you deal with inputs of unbounded lengths, and as language evolves, new concepts get introduced all the time, new words shift meaning, all of these things that you have to deal with when you look at language learning. Anyway, so this is sort of language per se, and then following from that, there's the case for grounded language learning, which is really what I'm here to talk about today. So now that I've convinced all of you to switch from vision to language research, let's take the next step together and switch to grounded language learning. And this being a slightly loaded term these days, I thought I'd sort of start with a very simple definition that we can just stick to the rest of the talk. Saying, grounded language learning is sort of learning language through association with other sensory motor experiences. This is sort of reasonably broad and covers vision, but also other kinds of input you could think of. And this is the key. As I said before, language is uniquely human, and we can only learn language by looking at the human or by modeling agents that sort of imitate the human. But of course, this is only half the truth. At the same time, language is fundamentally connected to the world. We use language to communicate about the world, to affect change in the world. And, sure, we can use language for internal thoughts and very, very abstract concepts, but ultimately our use of language derives from us being situated in the world. And therefore, all of these sensory motor experiences that come with it. There is, of course, another reason, again, to study grounded language learning, which is that when you think about ultimate applications of the kind of things that we research on, the kind of applications people in industry want to develop, a lot of these things are where we want machines to understand or utter language in relation to the real world. If I want my household robot to go find my glasses, I really want the household robot to understand, what glasses look like and that this is a very concrete physical object. There's also, a slightly more tenuous point. NLP systems these days and computer vision systems these days, they derive their knowledge from training systems on billions of words or millions of images or hundreds of millions of VQA question-answer pairs. And this inherently limits our ability to teach machines to comprehend language or learn things in situations where annotation comes with a price tag. And compare that with the human language effort, which is so efficient and so cheap by comparison in terms of the required amount of stimuli. And actually, interestingly, I think most many core machine learning topics these days are fundamentally looking at this to some extent. One-shot learning, sample-efficient learning, transfer learning, multitask learning, and also memory networks and a lot of the things that we're doing here in the VQA community. So this kind of gives you a second definition to think of as grounded language learning, which is sort of grounded language learning as a means of imitating or adopting ideas from human language learning. Let's make the whole thing a bit more concrete. And so this is from a study from Sam Gershman and Joshua Tenenbaum a couple of years ago. They had these sentence pairs. And so just read the first sentence. So a young woman in front of an old man. And then looking at the other four sentences, which of those is the most similar? A young man in front of an old woman in front of a young woman behind an old man, or an old man behind a young woman. Let's do this with a really quick show of hands. Who thinks it's the fourth one? Who thinks it's one of the first three ones? Okay, so everyone else hasn't paid attention. That's basically 100% for the fourth sentence. That's great. All humans say this. And so what Sam Gershman and Joshua Tenenbaum did is they used all sorts of embedding models to test this. And like an MVRNN gives you that guy. A different MVRNN with a cosine function gives you that guy. A couple of other models, these guys. More models, and these models are actually starting to be trained on this particular task as well, and they still all get it wrong. And it's just getting worse. Like every embedding representation model that they could find, they threw at this, and they all got it wrong. And so why do you think that is? It's actually kind of simple when you look at this, right? You have this young woman in front of an old man, and you picture the scene, and it looks something like that. And then you take the other sentence, and you picture the scene, and obviously, an old man behind a young woman is the same scene. The image is the same. The text, in terms of the surface form, is the most different of all these candidates. And on some level, you can just say, okay, well, this is just surface form. It's very different from, semantic similarity and semantic meaning. At the same time, you can also say, well, this is kind of really annoying because if we understood language properly, then we should be able to tell these things. And now, I'm not saying that you can't learn this kind of stuff from language-only data. You could, right, with the right kind of training data, the right kind of, set of paraphrases and objective function to optimize for those things. Then you can get these equivalences. However, I think, it's safe to assume that you don't get this kind of language that much in the wild. And so going back to the study I referenced, obviously, standard language models do not pick up on this. And then, there's the whole infinite data point story. If you have infinite amounts of training data and all aspects of that data, all of the aspects of the information contained in that data we incorporate into our model, then we'd also solve this. But unfortunately, that's not how the real world works, last time I checked. So why do I care about fixing this? What are spatial relations anyway, and why do we care if machines get them right? As I said earlier, there's many reasons to look at grounded language learning, and likewise at imitating human language learning, the speed of acquisition, robustness, and so on. But then also, I think as I've touched on this, for applications, it also just helps to look 10 years into the future. And when you tell your self-driving car to park right in front of the post office, then you really hope that it gets sort of right in front, right, and it's not sort of a centimeter into this thing or like right in front, 10 meters behind, because that would be kind of painful. And spatial relations seem easy, but they're not. A man in front of a woman, we can probably sort of try to encode this, and you'll get something where we have some degree of consensus in this room. But think like, how would you define a concept like near? Oxford is near London. We're kind of near LAX right now, which is 20 miles. We're not near Hollywood, which is probably 40 miles. And like you guys are sitting near me, Chris Manning over there, 15 meters is not nearby. So this is really hard, and these sort of concepts only make sense when properly contextualized, and even then they're hard to sort of narrow down and properly define. And of course, there's other problems in NLP that we could solve with language grounding, but this seems like an easy one in the sense that when you get sort of the concept of nearness in the context of visual information, the context of scene information, then you can actually learn how humans use that thing. So how do we fix this? Well, grounded language learning. Let's get some information of spatial relations in text together with spatial relations in visual information and see if we can learn this kind of stuff. So this is our attempt at fixing this. This is a paper, it's an archive. I have the references at the end of the talk. And so, as discussed, what we wanted to do here is make language grounded in another modality. And vision seems like the obvious starting point for this one. And this is a very, very focused experiment just on seeing, can we get a language encoder to properly encode spatial relations? So with that in mind, the data set that we built came with a couple of desiderata. We wanted language and visual representations in there. We wanted this thing to focus on spatial relations and simplify everything else as far as possible. And so what we ended up with was this thing, the spatial relations data set, where you have basically this very simple layout with a couple of geographic objects, geometric objects in there, small number of those shapes, multiple objects per scene, and then sort of each of these scenes we would take, basically create images of from different viewpoints. And then for each of these viewpoints, we generate a synthetic description of that scene, and for some 60,000 of those also crowdsourced natural language descriptions, so asking people to describe what they see in this particular image. So the synthetic thing would look like that. There's a, sorry, I can't read this on my screen. There's a violet cone to the far right of a purple torus. The cone is in front of the torus. I mean, that's sort of sensible, not super interesting. The humans get a bit more interested here. Something like this. There's a small purple cone far to the right, slightly cut off at the edge of the screen. There's a slightly larger purple object that almost looks like a sideways outlined triangle, slightly farther away near the center of the screen. And they can go even further away. Where like the first guy sort of focused on the objects, the second guy now focuses very much on the room and the image as a whole, and then only in the end starts talking about the objects a little bit. So this is kind of a good data set, I thought, for this particular problem of spatial relations, in the sense that we get natural language, it's reasonably rich, it's still very much focused on spatial relations for sort of all of these objects in the scene. And so we used a reasonably simple model for seeing if we could use this to train a sensible language encoder. So the idea of sort of the task, the objective model of this object objective function of this model, this way around, was twofold. The first phase on the left-hand side is an encoder that takes different image. Well, the encoder takes text descriptions together with a camera coordinate of sort of multiple descriptions of a particular scene, combines all of these into this single scene representation R. And then in the second phase, which is independent of this encoding phase, that representation R is then used to generate an image of a new camera angle. It's important that these are two separate processes because this means the encoding of R happens before you know what the output coordinates are of the thing that you're supposed to reconstruct. The idea behind this being that thereby we get a scene representation independent of any particular camera coordinate, something that you can use to reconstruct a scene from any particular point of view. And then finally up there, there's sort of an autoencoder trick that we stole from a paper of Ali Islami's a few years ago. This is sort of something that helps you speed up training. I'm going to gloss over that, but we can talk about this later if you want. The key interesting bit here really is that thing on the left-hand side. Because when you throw away all of the complexity in the model, what you end up with is just a very, very bog standard language encoder. Text in, vector out. And that's the guy we care about. So does it work? Yes, that's good. You can't see it, just take my word for it. Oh, now you can see it. So the first evaluation is just this reconstruction thing, as in, can we encode a scene and then reconstruct the images from different camera angles afterwards, and do they make sense as far as the description is concerned? What we did for this is we used human annotators and showed them the generated sample together with the sort of synthetic description of that. Just asked them, does this match up? Are those the objects? Are the relations correct? Does everything match up? And like the synthetic language as input pretty much solves this task perfectly. Natural language in a transfer setting with synthetic language to help you training also does a pretty good job. But the main point of this is just to see, does the model learn something? The interesting bit comes later. So the next thing to look at was the viewpoint invariance. So this is still specific to the model, and this is sort of the idea of, if I have A to the left of B from one point and look at it from the other point, this should be the same as A to the right of B. And so do we get these equivalences right? And for that we compared basis of different encodings of the scene taken from opposite angles with encodings of different scenes from the same set of angles. And again, you can see sort of the blue things. Like the same scene representation just ends up being a lot more similar than the different scene representation. But the thing that we actually cared about was this paraphrase invariance thing. Here we go. So this is again the human ranking from the Gershman and Tenenbaum study. The idea being that you have this meaning-preserving transformation where you keep the objects as they are. You just swap the order in which you talk about them. And this is obviously the most similar in terms of meaning. We did exactly the same thing. So this has nothing to do with the visual aspect anymore. This is just us feeding sentences into the text encoder that got trained as part of the system. And the important thing is, we get this. And like the meaning-preserving transformation, our model is also ranked the most similar. The rest of the ordering is different, but I think that's also reasonably arbitrary. I mean, if you switch the nouns or the adjectives around in one of these sentences, you get change. But both of these things are different in different ways, so it's a bit tricky to figure out how they should be compared. So yeah, this is sort of a very convoluted way of showing how you can learn to encode spatial relations in a text encoder by throwing loads of other information at it. Yeah, that guy. So this is a start. This is sort of, think of this as the motivation for why can we use visual information to make language training better? Can we use multimodal things from the NLP perspective? And I think this is nice, but let's make the whole thing broader. And of course, there are a lot of other data sets that you could think of where you mix vision and language, particularly in the VQA effort. So I'm just going to showcase sort of one extra environment that we've recently built and released that I think could really help advance language grounding research further. And this is Street View. So, nobody's saying we're restricted to synthetic environments and synthetic information and like handcrafted grammars. We can go into real world, and this is kind of what we did with Street View. And so we constructed this data set which took some 100,000 images from New York and Pittsburgh and stitched them together so you have like this little interactive environment you can walk around in and look around in. And the whole thing is open source with an academic license, so you should go ahead and download it and play with it. But anyway, this is sort of what it looks like. Let's see, is that going to play? If the Wi-Fi were better, you'd see a video now of an agent running around Paris. It's really impressive, trust me. Seeing that the Wi-Fi is not working, we'll skip that part. Anyway, so this video that you imagine you're seeing right now, this was sort of taken from the first paper that we wrote for this at NeurIPS last year. And the goal there was mostly memorization. So this is dropping agents into this environment and getting them to memorize the city and then just telling them where to go and seeing if they can sort of locate themselves and then quickly go there. But sort of where language comes in is only now, in the sense that, like, why is Street View good? Street View is interesting because, it's the real world, it's really diverse imagery. It's large scale enough that you can do transfer testing on this properly. But the thing that I really like about it is that because it's the real world, there are plenty of natural language sources concerned with the imagery we see there. As in, you have newspapers, Wikipedia, guidebooks, regular books. There's loads of data sources that you could look at exploiting in connection with sort of the world that you observe in Street View. And particularly because it's a natural world, this also means you get pragmatics in a much different sense than you would in simulated environments where you ask annotators to write sentences. But I'll sort of keep this reasonably short. So the first task, language task that we tried on this environment was a bit more straightforward. What we did is we downloaded driving instructions from Google Maps, sampling random points in sort of our various data points of the street-learn data set, and then try to see if we can get agents to learn to read these driving instructions to move around the world. And again, so the initial model we tried for that is super straightforward. As in you have a bunch of encoders, LSTMs for language, CNNs for the vision part, and this sort of encodes the thumbnails and the text that you get as part of the instruction, as well as the actual observation. You have some temporal recurrent attention over that, which is sort of designed as a meta-controller to determine which instruction you're currently executing. And then finally, on top of that, there's a completely standard reinforcement learning actor-critic stack that then, in the end, puts out the action policy. And so this is what that looks like. Okay, this one is playing. That's good. So this is what this looks like in practice. And you have these agents running around, and like on the right-hand side, you sort of see highlighted which instruction the agent is currently most attending to. We tried both soft and hard attention variants of this. And this is good. Like it works at least some of the time in some of the variants. So there's different versions of difficulty in this. Step by step is the thing where you actually tell the agent which instruction it should be attending to. And then there's sort of harder versions where it has to figure this out by itself, where the incremental thing has some reward densification, at least to sort of make the exploration problem a little bit easier initially. But yeah, as I said earlier, again, this is just a start. There's more stuff to do here. I mean, particularly on this task, obviously, there are interesting, better models that you can explore there. You could look at OCR to actually read street signs and all of that kind of stuff. And you could try to do the same thing with natural language data. Maybe Yoav is going to talk about a similar effort of his later today. But I think the really interesting thing, and this is why I'm pitching this data set at this workshop here, is there are ways to combine this with other data to study more complex grounding problems. And you could think of this sort of to some extent as a kind of visual QA task where the questions are instructions and the answers are sort of the final goal destination if it's a navigating thing. But you're not restricted to that. You could also use this kind of environment for the kind of Q&A task where you need to explore but then still generate an answer at the end. And as I said earlier, there's really interesting natural language out there. So I guess in conclusion, there's sort of 4 points I wanted to make today. First of all, grounding is really useful to teach machines certain aspects of semantics. And then synthetic environments can be used for this in specific cases successfully. But more importantly, real-world environments should be used for that in the long term because they lead to better language, they allow for pragmatics in a much more important and meaningful sense. And then finally, and this is sort of the call for action, to move beyond declaratives and imperatives and maybe question-answer pairs where you have simple answers. We need to come up with other kinds of games in these environments that can teach more complex language to machines, that can teach us to link language in more interesting ways to these kind of machines. So yeah, that's all I had to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the talk, Karl. We can take one question. We can take one quick question. Yeah.
Thanks, Karl. So the last part of the work with Google Street View imaging, could you comment on what is the action space for the agent in the context that is it continuous navigation or does it jump between parameters? And where I'm going with that is, do you think for language routing that really matters? Like, you can just abstract away the role of action spaces and is that fine?
Yeah. So we had a poster for this yesterday at some workshop on navigation, and all of the people at CVPR were really confused because they were like your forward thing is a jump somewhere between 3 meters and 8 meters, and when you turn it's 20 degrees. So our action space is discretized. And yeah, you're completely right. I mean, we're not solving a control problem here. This is not a navigation problem in the sense of control. This is much more jumpy. But I think for the kind of language grounding stuff, this is still a good enough start. As a lot of the things that want to get out of this, it doesn't matter if you have super fine-grained control. What I want you to be able to do is I want you to be able to walk around, look around, and figure out how to identify the Starbucks or the bank or any famous building that you've seen described in a newspaper article, say.
Thank you, Karl.